Deleuze versus Hegel. This is something that, since I've read Deleuze, I've been wanting to talk about. And what sparked my interest to make this video is that one of my friends was arguing with a Hegelian in a YouTube comment section. And I'll put those texts up here so that you guys can read them in their disagreement. And I'm pretty sure the video is about, it's Deleuze talking in a lecture about Hegel immediacy and whatnot. And so a bunch of Hegelians are in the comment section arguing that Deleuze doesn't understand Hegel. And I think it's the opposite, in that Hegelians don't understand Deleuze. And someone who I know has brought up an objection about Deleuze's interpretation of Hegel. But I think it was just wrong, and they didn't know enough about Deleuze and difference to even formulate coherently their own disagreement. And so it's worth just talking about the two positions in principle. I don't want to get super in-depth into difference itself for Deleuze. Just lay out in principle the differences and where I think that the Hegelians are wrong. And so let's talk about Hegel first. For Hegel, you have identity, and then you differentiate the thing through negation, right? So this book is not this mic, right? And so we negate it. We negate it through differentiating properties, and in a Hegelian sense, there is that this becomes subsumed in its dialectic, because you have the concept, you have a negation, and then it gets sublated into a higher ordered concept, right? And so it's easy to understand why for Hegelians they think that we can't talk about concepts, ideas, I guess they make a distinction between concept and idea, without representation taking form of a hold of a concept. And Deleuze is arguing that we can. And one of those ideas is difference in itself. And that we don't have identity first, but first we have difference. And then out of difference, what Deleuze calls the virtual, you get these temporary blockages of identity. So identity is produced out of difference. So out of difference, you get the book, and then you get the mic. And then you get this sort of second order differentiation out of difference in itself. What Hegelians take to be difference is what Deleuze sees as a product of difference in itself. Just to lay out in principle the distinction there. And as you see in the comment section, the guy argues that, and I'm not sure if this is how Hegelians will typically represent it, what the guy said in his first line, where he says all representation is repetition, and then my friend says you've just undermined yourself, right? Because if all representation is repetition, what for Deleuze that's going to mean is that repetition doesn't mean return of the same, right? That's why he interprets Nietzsche's eternal return not as a sameness returning, but as a selective return. So, but for Deleuze, if you understand his notion of repetition, it is not repeating the same. Just to very oversimplify it, you can think about it as repetition as the driving force of change in the world, of variation in the world. It's what allows for things to develop, but towards no particular end. It's not teleological, right? It's just there's a there's a range of intensities, forces, and they happen to assemble in a particular place, in a particular period in time, whatnot, and they produce identities, or what seem temporary identities, blockages. And I guess what the guy's arguing is that for Hegel, you can't think of anything without representation, without it being turned into a concept. Think about what that means. Again, this is, of course, going with the entire Hegelian framework, is that you have the book, right? The book is determinate. It has a set of properties, blah, 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 blah. But there's not just one book, right? We have many books, and then we limit it to a category, to something determined, to a concept. And they're saying, well, that's the only way we can think about things, right? Because there has to be, I guess in an analytic philosophy sense, you have to have like predication. You have to have forms of predicate. You have to be able to predicate towards something in the present indicative form. S is P, as Derrida says. And what Deleuze is saying is that's not true. There's something that comes before that. There's something that comes before the something getting turned into an object, being able to differentiate from other objects. And that's difference in itself. So what the Hegelians aren't understanding is that difference isn't an empty concept. It's just not a concept as the Hegelians would define it. I forgot exactly. I don't know if it was Deleuze who made that differentiation between an idea and a concept. But when I say concept, I'm speaking in Hegelian sense. And when I say idea, I'm talking about things that aren't necessarily determinate. They're unstable in their meaning in like a Derridian way. And for Derrida, I think it's easier to think about this for me because I've read so much more of Derrida than I have Deleuze. And when I think of difference in the Derridian sense, I think of this endless movement of signifiers, of differentiation and deferral, its absence and its presence, right? The trace. I think of all of these things that Derrida says aren't concepts. And it was really hard for me to grasp what he was saying there at the beginning of my studying of Derrida, but now I think I understand. And it's the idea that language, when we speak of a thing, we speak of a signifier. But the signifier is itself devoid of anything in itself, right? That would be putting identity before difference. The signifier itself is the product. It is a temporary, in a Deleuzian way, temporary actualization of a field of potentialities, of a virtual field of potentialities. That means Derrida has a great quote, and I hope I'm saying it correctly, where he says that the signifier is just a signified positioned as signifier. And what does that mean? Well, it means even when we talk about signifiers, we're positioning it as an object of reference. But the point of deconstruction for Derrida is to delimit the concept of a stable object, of meaning, of identity, and show that something comes before identity, which is this play of signification. But the play of signification, then, to even talk about it, it becomes an object of determination in a Hegelian sense, in a syntactical sense. But just because in a syntactical sense we have to speak that way, which is what Derrida acknowledges, is that we have to speak in a form, in a predicatory sense. We have to use S is P, deconstruction, as blah 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 blah. That doesn't mean that we can't think outside of that framework. It just means that we're trapped in the signifier signified structure of language. But that's the very thing that Derrida seeks to overcome conceptually for us, is that there's a way of thinking about these concepts that doesn't involve limiting ourselves to placing the signifier first and then assuming that the signifier comes first and then we differentiate. No, the signifier is a product of the play of difference. Take the concept freedom, for example. Freedom as signifier doesn't differentiate itself by first being what it is, but rather through a certain context, which includes a play where what is absent is informing what is present, and that absence is constantly changing because the context is constantly changing. We're constantly in a new period of time. 2 seconds later, 3 seconds later, 5 seconds later, I'm constantly in a new environment, blah, 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 whatever. That whole shifting structure comes before the identity. Very similarly, Deleuze is saying something like that in Difference in Himself. So I know that it's my first video here, so I know probably I gave a terrible, oversimplified explanation. And for the Hegelians, if you guys watch this video, just ask questions if you want me to elaborate on anything. I'll make another video elaborating on anything. Even if you want me to make a video on going really, really deep into what Deleuze means by difference in itself, or what Derrida means by difference, and how you can talk about difference without it becoming an object of determination in a Hegelian sense, we can get really deep into that. But I want to just sort of lay out the groundwork for that sort of conversation, and hopefully it can be fruitful. I'm open to listening to you Hegelians about your ideas on this disagreement, but hopefully you can try to understand where we're coming from as well.